In 1884, delegates from 25 nations gathered in Washington, D.C. to settle a question that sounds, on its surface, purely administrative. Where does the day begin? They chose Greenwich. They chose England. And within 18 months of that decision, cartographic offices across Europe, Asia, and the Americas quietly retired their prior official map series, not because those maps were inaccurate, but because they referenced a different world. That retirement was never announced. There was no public ceremony, no academic debate, no explanation filed in any international record that has since been made fully public. The old maps were simply no longer taught. And here is the detail that doesn't fit. Dozens of maps produced before 1850, originating from at least 4 entirely independent civilizations, Arab, Chinese, Austronesian, and Ottoman, show identical inland lakes, river systems, and mountain ranges in regions that European explorers allegedly had not yet entered. No shared source has been identified. No academic institution has formally explained the convergence. If these maps were independently wrong in exactly the same way, that would be extraordinary. If they were independently right before the official surveys arrived to confirm them, then what exactly was being standardized out of existence in 1884? To understand why the borders changed at once, you have to go back to the cartographic traditions they replaced and to a single piece of parchment drawn in Constantinople in 1513 that should not exist at all. The map was made by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. He was not a mystic. He was not a forger. He was a military cartographer of the highest rank, a man who had spent decades at sea and who understood from direct experience the difference between a coastline that was guessed and a coastline that was measured. In 1513, working in Constantinople at the height of Ottoman imperial power, he assembled a world map from what he described in his own handwritten annotations on the parchment itself, as source charts going back to the time of Alexander, maps compiled from older traditions, older surveys, older knowledge that he himself did not claim to have originated. The map survived. Most of those source charts did not. What makes the Piri Reis map historically uncomfortable is not its age. It is one specific feature in one specific corner of the parchment, the rendering of a southern landmass below the recognized continents, with a coastline detailed enough to show subglacial mountain ranges and river inlets that were not confirmed by modern scientific survey until 1958, when seismic and sonar equipment finally penetrated the Antarctic ice sheet for the first time in recorded human history. In 1960, a United States Air Force cartographic analyst named Captain Lorenzo Burrows wrote a formal technical memo to a superior officer, noting that the Piri Reis map's southern coastline matched the subglacial topography of Antarctica with a geometric accuracy that could not be explained by any known European source chain. The memo was filed. The question it contained was not pursued. The official cartographic record has never formally answered it. Piri Reis himself pointed to older maps. That means the accuracy did not originate with him. It came from a tradition that preceded him, a tradition that, by 1513, was already disappearing from the institutional record. To find where that tradition began, you have to enter a building that no longer stands, in a city that was rebuilt several times over, along a river in what is now Iraq. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was not a library in the way that word is usually understood. Between the 9th and 13th centuries, it was a functioning institution of applied knowledge mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and above all, geography. Scholars from across the known world brought their findings there, translated them, tested them against each other, and refined them into systems that worked. The Islamic cartographic tradition that developed within and around that institution was not speculative. It was rigorously, methodically, empirical. Al-Idrisi, born in 1099 and working under the patronage of the Norman King Roger II of Sicily, spent 15 years producing a geographic compendium and a world map known as the Tabula Rogeriana. Completed in 1154, the tabula was not a decorative object meant to hang in a palace corridor. It encoded latitude using star angle tables, a methodology for correcting spherical distortion across a flat surface that the Portuguese maritime school would not independently develop for another full century. Al-Idrisi's map was accurate in ways that confounded later European cartographers who encountered it without understanding its underlying method. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan scholar who spent nearly 3 decades traveling across Africa, Asia, and Europe in the 14th century, served as a kind of living verification system for the geographic claims embedded in the Islamic mapping tradition, and his accounts, compiled across hundreds of thousands of miles of direct observation, consistently aligned with the spatial logic that Al-Idrisi had encoded 2 centuries before. The tabula survived in multiple manuscript copies, but something happened to those copies in transit between cultures. When European scholars and later colonial institutions reproduced sections of Al-Idrisi's work, the mathematical annotations, the spherical correction formulas, the star angle tables, the latitude verification methodology that made the map accurate rather than merely decorative were systematically absent from the reproduced versions. The content was copied, the method was not. Historians have not explained why that specific information was omitted, while the visual geography was preserved. The formulas survived in Arabic archives. The credit did not survive the translation. And this is where the first outline of the larger pattern begins to take shape. Because the Islamic cartographic tradition was not alone in what it knew, and not alone in what subsequently happened to that knowledge. In the same centuries, on the other side of the world, Chinese imperial cartographers, working under the direction of the Yongle Emperor, were producing geographic surveys of extraordinary scope and operational precision. Between 1405 and 1433, the Admiral Zheng He commanded 7 massive oceanic expeditions across Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, and the East African coast voyages involving hundreds of vessels and tens of thousands of personnel, representing the largest coordinated maritime intelligence gathering operation the pre-modern world had yet produced. Zheng He produced charts. A master chart was compiled from the data those voyages returned. That chart subsequently disappeared from the historical record. The Ming Dynasty, under different imperial leadership after 1433, issued administrative orders that historians have partially reconstructed orders that curtailed further maritime activity, classified existing sea charts under imperial restriction, and in some cases directed the physical destruction of records associated with the voyages. The exact scope of those destruction orders remains, in the language of archival scholarship, an open question. But the timeline is precise and documentable. The Ming Maritime Geographic Record was effectively sealed within 40 years of Zheng He's final voyage, and the tradition of open oceanic cartography it represented did not survive the administrative transition. Simultaneously, across the Pacific and Indian Ocean island networks, Austronesian navigators were maintaining a cartographic tradition encoded not in ink on parchment, but in physical objects. Stick charts constructed from palm fibers and shells that represented wave refraction patterns, current flows, star path alignments, and island positions across thousands of miles of open ocean. These were not primitive approximations of geographic knowledge. They were sophisticated spatial models, calibrated through generations of empirical testing that enabled reliable navigation across oceanic distances that European maritime technology of the same period could not yet reliably match. 3 traditions, 3 entirely independent methodologies developed across different continents and different centuries. 3 systems that encoded the same coastlines, the same ocean currents, the same geographic relationships, and all 3 were marginalized, classified, destroyed, or absorbed into European frameworks within roughly 80 years of each other between the mid-15th and mid-16th centuries. At first, this looks like coincidence. The timing could be explained by the general expansion of European maritime power during that period, by the natural displacement of older systems by newer technologies, by the ordinary friction of cultural contact. But the deeper you look at the specific mechanisms of each disappearance, the harder coincidence becomes to sustain. Here is twist 1. Stated plainly and without decoration, the old mapping systems were not erased because they were wrong. They were erased because they were right in ways that made the territorial claims of colonial expansion legally and geographically indefensible. A map that accurately shows a coastline, a river system, a territorial boundary, or a trade route is not a neutral document. It is evidence of prior knowledge, prior presence, prior claim, and evidence in the context of land seizure justified by the legal fiction of terra nullius. The doctrine that unmapped land was unclaimed land is a liability of the most fundamental kind. This is not a pattern that required a secret conspiracy to produce. It required only that the people doing the erasing understood, at some operative level, what they were erasing and chose to continue. In West Africa, in Amazonia, in the archipelagos of Southeast Asia, colonial surveyors and Jesuit missionaries arrived in territories that indigenous communities had been mapping and managing for generations. The Jesuit mission records from the period 1640 to 1680, preserved in fragmentary form across archives in Rome, Paris, and Lisbon, contain repeated accounts of indigenous guides leading European missionaries through landscapes with a spatial precision that clearly astonished the priests documenting it. The guides were navigating from memory, from oral boundary maps, from seasonal waterpath knowledge, encoded in language and transmitted across generations without any written document at all. When Jesuit cartographers tested the spatial descriptions offered by their indigenous guides against their own independently measured surveys, the correspondence was, in multiple documented instances, remarkable enough to record. The Jesuits filed the reports. Someone else filed them away. Those reports did not enter the official cartographic canon. The geographic knowledge they documented was not credited in any published European atlas. What entered the canon instead were the names of European surveyors, men who arrived after the knowledge existed, traveled through territory that had been spatially organized for centuries, and left with the institutional credit for having discovered it. The colonial powers understood, early and practically, that geographic knowledge was a form of strategic property. Philip II of Spain, who reigned from 1556 to 1598, maintained a system called the Padrón Real, a master chart held under royal authority in Seville, continuously updated with intelligence from Spanish voyages, from which all officially sanctioned maps were derived. Possession of accurate coastal charts by unauthorized parties was not merely discouraged under this system. Under Spanish law during Philip's reign, it was treated as a capital offense. The Dutch East India Company maintained its own parallel classification system for accurate navigational charts, internal documents not shared with partner institutions, not published in any accessible form, not permitted to leave company custody under any circumstance. The secrecy in both cases extended beyond the protection of trade routes. The Padrón Real was not simply a map of where Spain had sailed. It was a map of where Spain's territorial claims were geographically accurate, and more critically, where they were not. A corrected map, seen by the wrong person, could unclaim a continent. That was the threat. The anomalies in the field, meanwhile, kept accumulating in documents that the published maps were carefully constructed to contradict. Colonial surveys conducted across Africa and South Asia between 1750 and 1820 encountered, with a regularity that the published cartographic record does not reflect, evidence of prior geographic organization that predated any European presence, cleared survey lines cutting through dense forest interiors, stone boundary markers of a kind suggesting deliberate geometric land division at a scale requiring sustained institutional organization. Earthwork terracing patterns across areas later described in official documents as uncultivated wilderness without prior habitation. Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon, conducting their celebrated boundary survey in North America between 1763 and 1767, worked through a landscape already marked by human spatial organization of considerable antiquity. East India Company surveyors operating across the Indian subcontinent filed field notes that mentioned, with varying degrees of analytical specificity, pre-existing boundary markers that the surveyors themselves estimated as predating European arrival by centuries. Those field notes and the published maps derived from them are not the same documents. The field notes mentioned the markers. The published maps describe the same territories as unmeasured, unsurveyed, and effectively empty, legally available for the sovereign claim that followed cartographic declaration. Someone, at the level of institutional publication, made a decision about what the final map would say and what it would omit. That decision was not made once. It was made repeatedly, across multiple surveys, in multiple territories, conducted by multiple European powers operating under different flags, but arriving at the same cartographic conclusion. In October 1884, delegates at the International Meridian Conference in Washington voted to establish the Royal Observatory at Greenwich as the universal prime meridian, the fixed longitudinal zero, from which all geographic coordinates would henceforth be measured and verified. 22 nations voted in favor, 2 abstained, none objected publicly. 14 months later, the Berlin Conference concluded its formal division of the African continent among European colonial powers, drawing borders across territories that none of the conference participants had comprehensively surveyed, using a coordinate system that had just been made universal and that made every prior map, every prior treaty, every prior territorial agreement referencing a non-Greenwich meridian technically unverifiable under the emerging framework of International Geographic Convention. Otto von Bismarck chaired the Berlin Conference. The cartographic standardization and the political border drawing occurred within the same 14-month window. No geographic society produced an independent study examining that timing. No international legal body raised a formal question about the effect of the coordinate reset on prior indigenous territorial agreements recorded under different geographic reference systems. The new prime meridian was described, in every public communication, as a scientific, advanced, neutral, universal, modern. One reading of this evidence is that it was simultaneously a legal instrument, that the standardization of coordinates was, at the same moment, the standardization of territorial legitimacy, retroactively erasing the geographic frameworks under which older land claims had been documented, recorded, and potentially enforced. Twist 2. The 1884 standardization was not merely a scientific upgrade. It was a legal reset. Every prior map, every treaty, every boundary record that referenced a non-Greenwich meridian became, in the new framework, technically anomalous, not illegal exactly, but unverifiable by the new standard, and therefore unenforceable in any territorial dispute adjudicated under the new system. No colonial power objected to this consequence. Their collective silence is its own kind of archival document. Halford Mackinder, the British geographer who published his foundational theory of the geographical pivot of history in 1904, understood geography not as a neutral description of the physical world, but as the structural argument underlying all political power. His heartland theory, the proposition that control of the Eurasian interior determined global dominance, required a specific map of the world to appear coherent, a map centered on Europe, with the rest of the world arranged around it in proportions that made European spatial dominance appear geographically self-evident. Older geographic frameworks, which centered different meridians, emphasized different regions, and encoded land area relationships using proportional logic derived from actual measurement rather than navigational convenience, made the heartland theory look not like science, but like preference. Those frameworks were, by 1904, already being removed from institutional circulation. The Royal Geographical Society's archives from 1880 to 1910 document a sustained program of cartographic reform, the replacement of older map series with Greenwich-referenced editions, the reclassification of non-European cartographic materials from active geographic references into historical curiosities, and the gradual exclusion of non-European cartographic traditions from the survey syllabi of colonial universities. Between 1890 and 1920, colonial education ministries across British, French, and German imperial systems issued curriculum reform orders mandating standardized atlases that presented the Mercator projection as the default world map, that credited European cartographers as the originators of systematic geographic knowledge, and that contained no reference to the Tabula Rogeriana, to Zheng He's charts, to Austronesian navigational systems, or to the indigenous boundary mapping traditions documented so carefully in the Jesuit records, the excluded traditions were not crude. They were, in several documented cases, mathematically more sophisticated than the European methods that institutionally replaced them. That sophistication was not cited as a reason for their exclusion. No reason was publicly given at all. The curriculum changed. The knowledge was reclassified as pre-scientific, as ethnographic artifact, as cultural inheritance rather than technical system, and it stopped being taught to the engineers, administrators, and surveyors who would draw the next generation of borders. You do not ban a map because it is wrong. You ban it because someone might notice it is right. The physical removal of archival evidence followed a slower and quieter trajectory. In London, Lisbon, Brussels, and Tokyo, the early decades of the 20th century produced a series of archival transfer and reclassification events that moved pre-Greenwich coordinate maps from active reference collections into restricted or effectively inaccessible storage. Lord Curzon, serving as Viceroy of India from 1899 to 1905, oversaw a comprehensive reclassification of India Office Survey records, a bureaucratic process that moved field survey notes, including documents that historians have subsequently identified as containing explicit references to pre-colonial boundary markers, into classification categories that restricted academic access for decades afterward. The maps moved in these processes were not destroyed, and that distinction changes the interpretation entirely. Destruction implies disposal, the judgment that something has no further value. Transfer implies the opposite. Someone, operating at the institutional level, decided these documents needed to be preserved but not consulted, retained but not accessible, kept but not read. They were not burned, they were moved, which is almost worse because it means the institution understood what it held, assessed that understanding as a risk, and acted accordingly. And then, in 1929, in Istanbul, a Turkish historian named Halil Edhem was conducting a routine inventory of the Topkapi Palace collections when he found the parchment. Piri Reis's 1,513 world map had been in the palace library for 4 centuries, catalogued as a historical document, unexamined by anyone with cartographic training for as long as the institutional record indicated. Halil Edhem recognized its significance immediately and published his finding. The broader academic community took notice, cautiously. And then, in 1960, the United States Air Force examined the map with an analytical seriousness that civilian academic institutions had not yet applied. Captain Lorenzo Burrows, writing formally to a superior officer, noted that the southern coastline of the Piri Reis map matched, with geometric precision, his analysis could not attribute to chance or approximation. The subglacial topography of Antarctica, as revealed by the seismic surveys conducted during the International Geophysical Year of 1957 to 1958. The Antarctic ice sheet reaches nearly 3 kilometers in thickness in its deepest sections. The coastline beneath it was not mapped by any modern expedition before those surveys. Piri Reis had rendered it in 1513 from older sources, which themselves described their origins as ancient. Twist 3. The map survived because it was misclassified, filed as a curiosity, shelved as a relic, never formally evaluated as evidence by any cartographic institution with the authority to pursue what it implied. The tradition that produced it was erased. The data it encoded was not. No official cartographic body, in the decades since Burrows committed his finding to paper, has produced a formal explanation for the accuracy. The question has been raised repeatedly by independent researchers. It has been met with dismissal, with silence, and occasionally with methodological objection, but not with explanation. And dismissal is not the same thing as an answer. The Mercator projection, the rectangular grid map that has dominated Western cartographic education since Gerardus Mercator published it in 1569, and that remains, as of 2024, the foundational world map in most digital navigation interfaces, distorts land area in ways that are mathematically precise and geographically consequential. Regions near the poles appear dramatically larger than their actual surface area relative to equatorial regions. Greenland appears on the Mercator map to be roughly comparable in size to Africa. Africa contains more than 50 sovereign nations, more than 1 billion people, and a landmass approximately 14 times larger than Greenland. The map does not show this. Dennis Wood, the cartographer whose 1992 study examined the political function of maps as persuasive instruments rather than neutral descriptions, observed that the persistence of the Mercator projection in educational and institutional contexts, long after its navigational utility had been superseded by technically superior alternatives, was not straightforwardly explained by any geographic or scientific rationale. Alternatives existed and had been formally proposed. The Peters projection, introduced in 1974, rendered land areas in accurate proportional relationship. It was adopted by international development organizations and simultaneously criticized by mainstream geographic institutions, a disagreement framed in the language of technical cartography, but carrying, underneath, a structural argument about which territories appeared large, which appeared small, and what that appearance implied about relative significance and historical weight. The United Nations cartographic standardization processes established after 1945 organized international mapping practices around the Greenwich coordinate system and the Mercator projection without a public deliberative process. About the implications of those choices for the legibility of colonial-era territorial claims or the visibility of the geographic knowledge systems those claims had displaced, the most powerful map in the world was chosen, not discovered, not derived inevitably from the mathematics of the Earth's surface, chosen by specific institutions at specific moments, for reasons the documentary record has preserved only partially. Somewhere in Lisbon, in an archive whose catalog has not been fully reconciled against its actual holdings, there are survey records from the Portuguese colonial period that have not been opened since their transfer in the early 20th century. Somewhere in the British Library, there are folios classified under geographic history subcategories that have not been cross-referenced against the field survey notes they were administratively separated from decades ago. Somewhere on the Piri Reis map, there are coordinates, specific, measurable, geometrically encoded positions that have not been matched against physical locations by any expedition carrying modern survey technology to the sites they appear to indicate. Contemporary researchers working at the intersection of historical geography, archival recovery, and indigenous knowledge documentation have established that dozens of pre-colonial geographic knowledge systems are confirmed to have existed and are confirmed to be no longer accessible through any public institutional channel. Not lost through neglect or the ordinary entropy of time, displaced, moved, reclassified, or physically removed during a specific historical window corresponding with uncomfortable precision to the period of colonial cartographic standardization between roughly 1880 and 1920. No international inquiry has been formally opened into that displacement. No institution with the authority to answer the question has asked where the transferred originals are currently held. The question has not become unanswerable. It has simply stopped being asked. Every map is an argument. The ones they stopped teaching were arguments that someone lost not because the evidence failed them, but because the institution responsible for counting the evidence changed the rules by which evidence was recognized. The borders did not move because the land moved. They moved because the maps that remembered the land differently, that encoded prior knowledge, prior presence, prior claim in coastlines and river systems and boundary markers and star angle formulas, were quietly, methodically, institutionally made to disappear. And somewhere, in a corridor that smells of old paper and sealed stone, on a shelf that has not been disturbed in 100 years, the original argument is still waiting. The parchment is still there. The coastline is still accurate. The question is still unanswered, and the archive has not yet been opened.